Okay, hello and welcome everyone to this session of Net Zero Week brought to you by YPO and iNetwork. My name is Louis Stockwell. I'm the Connected Procurement and Commissioning Programme Coordinator at iNetwork, and I'll be facilitating today's webinar, which is on the topic of decarbonisation strategy and development and implementation as well in the local public sector. So as the title suggests, really, the aim of today's session is just to explore what decarbonisation strategies, what sustainability strategies are in place across local public services, how they're being implemented, and what some of the key barriers are as well as we strive towards those collective net zero targets that we all have. So to discuss this, I'm really delighted to be joined today by a fantastic panel of speakers who've kindly volunteered their time to come and talk about this really important issue with us. So in no particular order, we have David Hulliston, who is the Strategic Lead for Policy and Partnerships at Manchester City Council. We have Mike Sewell, who is the Plan Zero Director at Mighty. And finally, we have Kevin Tracy, who is Head of Procurement at North Yorkshire County Council. So just a couple of very quick housekeeping items really to mention before we dive into the topic with some questions. You should be able to see that there is a chat box on the side of your screen where you can take part in the live conversations. Just to make you aware, the feed you are watching right now is pre-recorded, but we have asked our panelists to see if they can join the live broadcast on June the 15th. So depending on how we get on with timings today, we might potentially come back on and be able to do a live Q&A after the recording, or failing that, we'll do our best to answer any questions in the chat box. Likewise as well, if you have any kind of really burning questions that you feel like we didn't answer in the discussion or in the chat box, then if you want to drop either myself or one of the YPO organising team an email, we'd be really happy to follow up with you after the events. A couple of other very quick things to mention. You can use the menu icon on the top left of your screen to navigate back to the event agenda, where you can see all of the upcoming sessions for Net Zero Week and a bunch of webinars as well. And there should be also a link at the bottom of your screen, which will take you to a page where you can register for any of those. Finally, again, just to say that we're really eager to spread the word about Net Zero Week and about all the different sessions. So please do help us do that. Share it with colleagues, share the links. If you're on Twitter as well, please do join the conversation at hashtag YPONetZero and hashtag iNetworkNetZero. So that's enough from me, I think. We'll kick off with the conversation now. And I just thought it might be useful to begin by doing a very quick 5-minute introduction really from each of our panelists. So I'll start with you, David, if that's okay. I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit more about your organisation specifically and your role and how your role relates to kind of the decarbonisation agenda.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Louis. Yeah, my name's David Hulliston, as you've said. So I'm Strategic Lead for Policy and Partnerships. So I manage a team, city policy team at Manchester City Council. So we do policy and strategy work, but we also do implementation and delivery. And we've got quite a large programmes team who deal with European funding and other grant funding. So the team itself covers a range of areas, including strategy and economic policy, culture, zero carbon, communities and VCSE, and projects and programmes. So it's quite a big brief. And actually, zero carbon and climate change is very much one of the cross-cutting things that cuts across all of those teams. So my role, I've been involved in climate change for a number of years. And as a council, we've had a climate change action plan, which I'll probably talk a bit more about in detail later on. So we, as a team, wrote that plan for the council and are very much the heart of the programme management in terms of driving that forward across the organisation. So that ranges from obviously the implementation of the actions in the plan, some of the monitoring of those, but also bringing in external funding to deliver key aspects of the plan itself. And there's also a kind of a citywide dimension as well to our work, which again, I'll talk a bit more about in detail, which is the kind of Manchester Climate Change Partnership as well. So we have a kind of a devolved partnership approach to delivering climate change in Manchester. So that's kind of the main focus of my role in relation to climate change. Quite a varied and broad remit.
No, thanks, David. That's great. And thanks again for joining us. Great to have you with us. Can I ask the same to Kevin, if you want to just tell us a bit more about your role and Kevin at North Yorks and how that relates to decarbonisation?
Sure, thank you. And hi to everyone. My name's Kevin Tracy. I'm Head of Procurement and Contract Management at North Yorkshire County Council. I'm also the Chair of the Yorkshire and Humber Strategic Procurement Group, so the heads of procurement for our region. So our spend collectively as a region is about £6 billion pounds a year. Again, in my role at the county council, our spend is around 460 million pounds a year. We are the largest county in the country, over 3,300 square miles, so a big rural county council. My team looks after centralised procurement, so anything to do with our external expenditure. We also look at policy and strategy around contract and supply chain management. And I guess specifically our role is to make sure that carbon reduction and wider social value is baked into our procurement and our contract management processes. I sit on a beyond carbon board at the county council. My remit obviously is around supply chain and its impact on our carbon usage at the county council. So it's becoming fast becoming a key element of what we're doing around supply chain and our work there. Whereas maybe in the past we've looked at value in terms of pounds and savings, that wider social value and particularly our climate impact is more and more vital to us and is taking up a lot more of our work. So what we're looking at is policy and strategy, how we can liaise with our supply chains and really drive improvements in that area.
Yeah, absolutely. No, great. Thanks, Kevin. And finally, Mike, I know you're coming at this from a slightly different angle from Mighty. I know Mighty do a lot of great work with the local public sector around energy services and a range of different other things. So could you tell a little bit more about that and about what you do?
Yeah, sure. So, hi, my name's Mike Sewell. I'm the Plan Zero Director for Mighty, and my purpose is basically to help develop and support organisations to develop and implement Plan Zero strategies, so to ultimately deliver on the net zero agenda. And really, for me, the key part around that is decarbonisation services. So it's actually how can we help organisations get to that point. And for every organisation we work with, it's a different set of solutions. That there are certain sort of common elements, but it's how to do that. Why do we want to do this? I mean, as Mighty, we touch a lot of organisations, provide a lot of facilities, management, engineering, project support, and ultimately this is the biggest challenge that's facing not only our organisation but all our customers and the UK, the world. I know that's sort of cliched, but it really is that significant, and we recognise that we've got a very big part to play in that. So if I sort of look at ourselves as organisation internally, we're not great property owners, but what we have to do is a lot of travelling to get to places to do what we need to do. So about 85% of our carbon emissions actually sits in our fleet, in our vehicles. So there's two things we can do around that. One, can we use technology more cleverly to not need to make that journey? And if we need to make that journey, can we do that in a better way? And I think EV is clearly a better way. So, it's probably no surprise, we like to think we're sort of one of the leading lights now in terms of, by 2025, we will be scope 1 and 2 net zero. And that will be because our fleet will be fully electrified. I think we're about 1,200 vehicles now, probably be about 6,000 vehicles by then. And, and then scope 3, clearly that's a longer process for us. But in terms of what we're doing, it's also helping our customers, because as soon as anyone we're working with is looking at their scope 3 emissions, they're going to be looking for organisations like us to be doing our job as cleanly as we can. So, where my role is really exciting is it's basically the focus to make sure we're doing it right to ourselves, but also how can we bring all those ideas and technologies and things to bear, to organisations such as sort of represented here today. So I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be part of this panel and really to be part of the discussion and the debate.
Great, thanks, Mike. No, it's great to have you. Thanks for joining again. I think just to set the scene really for this conversation, I think it would be useful maybe just to ask, particularly our local authority colleagues, just kind of where we're up to with our decarbonisation strategies and net zero strategies. So thinking specifically around targets and scoping and timescales as well. I know there are different dates that are kind of floated around, and me as a kind of non-expert, I think it can get a bit confusing at times. Are we 2030, 2035, 2050? So just to get a kind of highlight of overview of where we're up to really in the sector with our strategies. I don't know if David, you want to come in on that one first?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, the first probably important point to make is we've been at this for quite a long time. So I think it's become more prominent, obviously, in the news over the last few years. But we've actually been working on this agenda since back sort of 2009, 10. And we had Manchester A Certain Future back then, which was the city's first climate change strategy. And we established Manchester Climate Change Agency in about 2016. So we have got quite a long track record of taking action. I think a lot's changed in the last few years, clearly since COP21 in Paris. It was a big game changer. And what we approved in November 2018 was a science-based carbon budget approach to our targets. So I think, as you've quite rightly pointed out, it's very confusing because you've got the UK government net zero 2050, and then it sort of often feels like a competitive race between different places around who can get there the soonest, but I think they all mean slightly different things. So just to clarify on ours, we work with the Tyndall Centre and an organisation called Antithesis to look at a carbon budget for Manchester. What's our slice of the pie? So if you look internationally at nations and you look at things like shipping and aviation, and you look at UK, what's Manchester's slice of those emissions, and what does that need to be plotted like on a graph to make sure that we stay within Paris compliant in terms of climate change. And what we end up with that is a zero carbon date of 2038. But I think, although we talk about that date, and Greater Manchester has also adopted the same approach using the same tool, what we're really talking about is urgent action now. So it's kind of less important what your end date is, because if your trajectory to that end date isn't as steep, then you're going to actually emit more carbon than you should do in relation to being COP21 compliant. So without getting too technical, what we've really tried to focus on is urgent action. And one of the things that's helped us as a local authority was declaring a climate emergency in July 2019. And since that's basically been the platform for us to develop our climate change action plan for the council. So the way it works in Manchester is we have a climate change partnership. So we have the citywide objectives, and then all of the members of that climate change partnership, including the city council, have their own action plans. And the partnership represents about 20% of the city's emissions. So they're under direct control of those emissions. So it's our partners like universities, Manchester City Football Club, housing associations, faith, VCSE, culture, etc. So we then ask people to set action plans, and the council's own action plan runs for 5 years from 2020 to 2025. And it commits us to halving our emissions in terms of scope 1 and 2 emissions over the next 5 years. So it's pretty ambitious in terms of the actions in there. And since we approved that in March 2020, we've now got an investment pipeline of about 100 million in projects internally and externally funded to deliver on that action plan. So that's kind of where we're at in terms of the targets. In terms of priorities, the plan sort of breaks down into a number of different areas. So we've got priorities on, we've got a section on buildings and energy, one on travel and transport, one on reducing consumption-based emissions and influencing suppliers, one on carbon storage, sequestration and climate adaptation, and then one about catalysts for change and how we do behaviour change in the city. And each of the actions for the council look both internally as an organisation and the actions that we should take, but also that kind of critical role that local authorities play in terms of influencing the city and obviously a key stakeholder in the city and how we can influence. So an example would be there are actions in there around our own electric vehicle fleet at the council and converting our Biffa waste fleet, which we've spent over 9 million on converting into half of them to electric vehicles. But then the other aspect of that will be how we influence in travel and transport across the whole of the city, working with partners like Transport for Greater Manchester. So just to make that point that it's kind of organisational, but also the role within the rest of the city.
Yeah, thanks, David. I mean, Kevin, is it a similar kind of journey from a North Yorkshire perspective? I mean, obviously, a very different region in terms of geography and economy, etc. Is it similar kind of targets and journey and priorities from your perspective?
I think so. Although I guess in terms of early adoption, we are probably sort of catching up with Manchester and other areas. In terms of our region, our regional chief executives group gave us a target in 2019 around carbon reduction. So that was the the sort of first instruction to us as a procurement group around setting aside previous targets, but this is around carbon reduction explicitly. But in terms of the county council, our aim is net carbon neutrality by 2030, or as close to that as we possibly can. But we've also signed up to the York and North Yorkshire Local Enterprise Partnership ambition. So that's to be the first carbon negative region in the country. So carbon neutral by 2034 and carbon negative by 2040. So sort of a big step beyond just being carbon neutral. And as I referenced earlier, the programme board that I sit on is looking at a specific carbon reduction plan. So there's a number of areas who are contributing to that. Supply chain is clearly one of those. And we're just looking at political sign-off on that. But certainly in terms of intensity, our drive and our ambition is really speeding up. So there's a lot of work going into this. And I say it feels like very quickly updating, planning on improvements we can make on that.
Yeah, well, thanks, Kevin. And Mike, finally, from your perspective, I mean, would you do you recognise kind of where David and Kevin are coming from there in terms of targets and priorities from your perspective? Does that kind of align with you as well?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, I think what we're finding is that lots of organisations, they have different targets, and I think we all know where, in a sense, UK PLC sits. But actually, if we want to make the real difference that we need to make, we need to be somewhat ahead of that. I think the reassuring piece for me in both cases is there's a plan, or if not a fully signed off plan, it's intention to put a plan in place. And I think that's the absolute, key. I mean, for me, it's always about, when I look at our part to play, it's how we can work with someone. Sometimes we create someone's plan. There are organisations who just don't have a plan at all. I think, if there is, then it's okay. What are the component parts, and how can, and it's a circle for me as well, because this isn't a linear journey. There's lots of things we'll do once, and we'll probably do it a second time, and a third time, and a fourth time, and so many things change along the way as new technologies become available, costs of things change, behaviours change in certain areas. So I think in both cases, what's really reassuring to see is that there's a date well in advance of 2050, and the intention to put a very clear plan across all those key areas, and that has to be the way to take this forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Mike. Just moving on there, I think thinking about kind of what net zero actually looks like and definitions, I think, an important part of any planning or strategy is to have those clear definitions of those goals and what the kind of endpoint looks like. So I'm just thinking specifically from a kind of local authority perspective, to David, maybe, what does net zero really look like for Manchester? How will we know when we've got there? What will the city look like? What will the places look like?
Yeah. That's a great question, because no one's cracked it yet, have they? But I think, from my perspective, I think it's important to think about the organisation, and obviously it's really important to measure our emissions, as we've said. So we don't do carbon offsetting in Manchester. So when we talk about zero carbon, we're talking about actually a 95% reduction from the initial point in terms of the carbon budget approach. So we do want to do, genuine zero carbon in terms of our emissions. But we're only a couple of percent of the emissions in Manchester. So a net zero local authority won't necessarily make a tremendous difference to the city or the place it's in, the local authority area, unless we take our partners with us on that journey. So I think that's a key aspect for us. I think we need to lead by example, and doing that, obviously we want to be that organisation. And I think where that's at in terms of a journey and functioning for us, which was in your question, I think is trying to make that everyone's business. So we've got a corporate plan for the organisation, and Zero Carbon Manchester is one of those corporate plan priorities. So we need to be getting to that point where it's everyone's business. And I think in the past it's been pigeonholed a little bit as certain services and departments, whereas now we're at the point where we're doing carbon literacy training for all our staff. We're trying to kind of get more and more services to be thinking about that, more sessions with departmental management teams. All decisions that we take, we've got an objective that zero carbon will be reflected in those. It's on all the committee reports that go through the council. So I'm not trying to say we're there yet, but I feel like we're in a very different place than we were a few years ago in terms of this being really a central priority for the council, along with things like addressing inequality and some of the impacts from the COVID pandemic. So I think as an organisation, what it looks like is obviously being able to measure and monitor your emissions. So your buildings, your fleet, your workforce in terms of how they move around for work, all being zero carbon, but also that kind of zero carbon culture in terms of how you operate, how decisions are made, how money's spent, etc. And I think that's probably an even greater challenge almost than the first element. So we think about development in the city. Manchester's a growing place. It's growing really fast. The area we're into at the moment is more of the kind of consumption-based emissions. So into kind of scope 3 emissions, procurement. So we've just recently approved an uplift of our social value from 20% to 30%, with 10%, the additional 10% being for environmental weighting. So we're trying to push more through our supply chain. But obviously when it comes to construction, new buildings, etc., we're trying to get to a higher standard around those kind of consumption-based materials, the things we use and throw away, etc. So that's what it kind of looks like for me. But as I say, we're kind of very much kind of on that journey, and we hope to get there over the next few years.
Yeah, just on that point around offsetting, David, is really interesting. I didn't know that. So is that a decision that, that in your net zero calculations, you decided not to go with down the offsetting route? Do you know if that's sort of specific to Manchester or other places in the sector doing it, and kind of what's the rationale behind that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends what approach you take and what modelling you use. So obviously, as I mentioned earlier on, we've used the science-based carbon budget approach, which means we can emit no more than 15 million tonnes of carbon as a city between 2018 and 2100, which is where we get our kind of graph to zero. As I said, it was about a 95% reduction. So yeah, that model doesn't use offsetting. So other places you may see getting to carbon neutral earlier, but will include offsetting. But that's not to say that climate adaptation and tree planting, etc., isn't important to us. So we've currently got a £1 million programme of tree and hedge planting underway across the city, which is a 2.5-year programme. But although we have kind of the benefits in terms of livability, health, greening the city of those things, air quality, etc., we're not actually able to offset them against our emissions. So we're talking about a true zero carbon approach. So I think it does vary from place to place, which is probably part of the complexity for people when they're trying to understand what all these targets mean.
Thanks. That's clarified, actually. Thank you for that. So, Kevin, I guess going back to that question around what net zero actually looks like from a North York's perspective, again, obviously very different region. What kind of what we're going to expect to see, and how will you know when we have a net zero North Yorks?
Yeah, it's I guess very different to that city approach. 85% of North Yorkshire is defined as rural or super sparse. So, and as we said, a huge area. So I guess the principles remain the same. The targets, the aspiration. I guess it's the delivery mechanism and that complexity. And just thinking around how we deliver our services as a council. So social care has to be delivered, again, as we said, over thousands of square miles. So in our current approach, it is people getting in cars and vehicles and travelling distance. I remember when we first brought in electric vehicles into our fleet, no one would use them, because what you don't want to do is get left stuck in the dales or up on the moors somewhere, because we just didn't have that distance. So there's some behavioural changes, and in terms of how we think around how we deliver our services just across that huge area, and it can't be a reason not to do these things. So our rurality actually gives us some opportunity in how we can do things differently. We think of the amount of premises we have across our county. One of the things around what we've learned now is we can do things like this. We can video conference and we can deliver things in a way that we maybe didn't think of before. So I guess the rurality and some of the obstacles that we maybe thought around how we can deliver this as a county actually maybe aren't as big or as difficult as what we thought, or at least we can accelerate our approach to how we can do something differently. But again, that aspiration has to be there, and in a large rural county, what's close to people's hearts is the beautiful countryside. When people think of North Yorkshire, that's what we want to protect and make sure that we are doing our piece on that. So yeah, I think we're in a different place geographically, but the aspiration and how we will get there will be similar, and I guess we'll be driven by that as local authorities. And picking up too what we can influence as a local authority and as an organisation, and our supply chains are huge in that, but equally not everything we buy is from North Yorkshire. So our supply chains are complex, multi-tier, and they will be across the United Kingdom and in fact beyond worldwide supply chains. So how do we influence that from our part and our region? But also, how do we influence behaviour of our residents? What example are we setting to the 600,000 plus residents of North Yorkshire? Are we setting a lead? Are we setting a good example? So there's a lot we can do that our rurality won't hold us back from.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thanks both. It's really good to hear those visions really outlined there, I think. So we've spoken a bit about kind of where we're up to and the vision for how we get there and what it will look like when we do get there. But I'm just curious to know people's thoughts on what the key barriers and challenges are as well as we push towards net zero. So, I mean, Mike, I'd be keen to bring you in on this. Obviously, you work with, different regions and local authorities across the country, etc. I'm just... do you have any thoughts on key barriers and challenges that we really need to overcome?
Yeah, I mean, there's sort of two or three that sort of immediately sort of come to mind, and probably almost part of my sort of daily challenge. And I don't think anyone would be surprised if I said funding was the first one. I mean, I think we've touched on already a lot of these things need change, and that change has a cost, and that doesn't really matter whether it's a building asset, a service, or just perhaps something you need to change in the way you do it. So I think we have to recognise that there is not an infinite pot of money to make these things happen, but that doesn't make the targets any less real. I think coupled with that, for me, it's also that there is no quick fix. I think that offsetting was mentioned earlier. I mean, this isn't about, even if you had the money, okay, well, I'll go and buy some offsetting and I can say I'm great. In some ways, I mean, there's even a trap there today, I think, with egos, where people, particularly electricity, can think, oh, well, if I go and buy this particular thing, I can claim that as being no carbon. I've achieved my objective. What that sort of forgets is actually, you don't want to use all that energy. So even if you can buy your electricity, so say net zero, you probably actually want to use half of it, so actually, energy efficiency fits into that. I think that the big thing is recognizing where the ultimate challenge sits. So if I just looked at it from a building perspective, decarbonisation of heating is the big thing. I mean, I think anything that involves using a fossil fuel today, you do not want to be using a fossil fuel tomorrow. So, if you're a major hospital and you've got a big CHP plant, which is quite common, combined heat and power, and that's coming up to the end of its life, you don't want to be replacing it with a CHP. If you've got a building now with a boiler, you don't want to be replacing it with a boiler. So it's embracing sort of other technologies, and there's a few traps waiting there. So a good example at the moment, if I just take one very specifically, is with heating. A relatively small building, you think, okay, I don't want to put a boiler in, I want to put an air source heat pump in. The problem with your air source heat pump is it's great from a carbon perspective, but it's going to use a lot more electricity than the boiler was using. So although it's great on the carbon, it's now sort of going to cost you 4 times what it was to run. Okay, now why is that? And is that acceptable? So is one willing to accept that higher cost to achieve your carbon target, or actually should we be going deeper and saying, well, hang on a minute, half of any gas or electricity kilowatt hour rate is the actual what you use. The other half are government add-ons, there are charges, there's additions. And at the moment, a lot of these things are pretty evenly spread across gas and electricity. Well, perhaps we need to put a lot more of those costs onto the gas and actually encourage people to actually, go down the electricity solution, so we've almost got this artificial situation where gas is a lot cheaper than electricity, but should gas be a lot cheaper than electricity? And is that driving a whole load of sort of behaviours and things? So at the moment, it's not recognising that money is finite, but perhaps we can just move some of the on costs around, that they actually encourage things and unlock business cases and let things happen. So literally, without any great prioritisation to those would be three things that I'm very much dealing with, I feel, every day with any organisation I work with, how to make things happen.
Yeah, no, thanks, Mark. That's really helpful. I think we did a session with social housing, or we have one in Net Zero Week, and I think it came out of that session that it's buildings, transport, and industry are the big three hurdles to overcome, right? I don't know if David or Kevin, you wanted to come in on that one in terms of the key barriers from your perspectives.
I think one from a procurement point of view is we've just come through a significant period of austerity, which has driven the idea that value is cost and budget reduction, and we have had to reduce budgets. So our focus has been on savings, and the political focus has been on that, quite rightly, because that's the direction we've had. So it's that trade-off between, and as we've just said, if something is going to help us in terms of carbon reduction, but is going to cost us more to run, how do we balance that trade-off between budgets that are being cut and targets set by central government on that? So it's really difficult to sort of balance that off, and you can't have your cake and eat it. So which is the most important, and that is a really difficult barrier, I think, to overcome, because sometimes that assumption is doing something that delivers more social value will cost us more. That's not always the case, but it's a challenge that we need to get to. So how can we still deliver the commercial efficiencies, but also deliver the climate and the carbon reduction improvements that we need to deliver?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And I think I'd also echo the points around buildings as well. I think that decarbonisation of heat is a real challenge, and we've seen a lot of progress with the national grid and the decarbonisation of the national grid in terms of electricity. But we've had recently the public sector decarbonisation scheme, which is a government initiative, and we've done really well out of that. Greater Manchester as a consortium got about 80 million and the council got 23 million. So brilliant news for our public buildings, but we're now in that kind of race in terms of the procurement and the expertise to deliver that, air source, ground source heat pumps. We've seen what's happening at the moment around construction materials and some of the shortages. So delivering these programs, they're quite tight in terms of turnaround from government, but then the delivery of them is really challenging. But the question, I suppose, will be great news for us around our public estate. We've got opportunities to decarbonise heat, but where are the kind of equivalent schemes for commercial buildings in the city? How are we going to support them? And then similarly on the domestic front, we're having investment from our social housing landlords, but there's still a massive gap in terms of getting to zero carbon for those properties, which needs addressing. But then where's the offer for the kind of private rented sector properties in the city? So I think that decarbonisation of heat is a major challenge for us.
Yeah. Could I just come back in on that? Because I think you made a really good point at the end there in terms of those incentives in the private sector. Because in many ways, I think what we've got at the moment, and I can't think of a time, probably in the last 20 years when I've been involved in this for quite a while, where we've had such a disparity between the incentives. Because you're absolutely right, from a sort of a private sector, there virtually isn't anything. Renewable heat incentive disappeared at the end of March. So at the moment, what actually incentivizes anyone in the private sector from a financial perspective to do something? And I think even within the public sector, the PSDS grant scheme is great, but actually at the same time, the Salix loan has been closed. Yet actually the idea that you actually had a business case where you could actually, in a sense, get interest-free investment into a project you then returned payment on, what's so wrong with that? Because the only problem with grants is they're only ever going to be exactly a pot, aren't they? Whereas actually I think the Salix piece was to some degree self-funding in its sense. Money flow back, more money could come out, things keep moving. And in a sense, the downside of PSDS seems to be with the next phase is that Salix has disappeared, which I think is a really sad thing, particularly when there was those, we'll fund 50%, you find 50%. There were so many mechanisms within it. So I think I know it's not all about financial incentives, but we are at quite an interesting time at the moment. And I think the private sector in particular, literally there is nothing really today of any note, bar maybe some network heating grants, which you get, which actually would incentivize any private landlord, other than the desire to drive change, to do something. And that can't be a sustainable, situation.
Yeah, no, thanks. But I think I'm going to be really unfair now and ask you to try and solve those problems that you've just identified on the course. I don't know if anyone, thinking particularly around decarbonisation of heating, Mike, I don't know if you wanted to talk a bit about thoughts or projects going on at Mighty looking at that specifically.
Well, it's interesting. I think just touching there about Manchester and some of the projects you're doing there. I think the projects, from a technology perspective, ground source heating is an excellent technology in terms of really using what Mother Nature has there in terms of helping us, heat something. I think what we have to remember with that, it's not all about just changing one heating source to another. Actually, the insulation of buildings, the fabric enclosure of a building, and I think that probably in the last 20 years, the focus is always, when we talk about buildings, is always around energy efficiency. And there is a direct correlation between energy kilowatt hours, carbon tons, and cost pounds. But I think what we've got, one of the ways of managing off the risk I shared earlier in terms of I've now put my air source heat pump in, using a lot more electricity, is do I need all that heating load? So I think for me, one of the big pieces now is actually trying to get buildings to work more effectively, and again, taking a longer term view on carbon. Why wouldn't you reclad that building? Why wouldn't you re-insulate that building? And I think one advantage is if you've done a net zero pathway, you can get to a situation that says, well, actually there is a cost of doing nothing, so I want to avoid that cost of doing nothing. So what are the things I sort of should do? So ground source heating, as I say, with that done, is great. Air source heating also has a great part to play in terms of, particularly on the heating side of things. But I think the other piece as well is actually coming back to incentives, the cost of carbon. This is an area where, at the moment, you could argue strongly that the carbon does not cost enough. So when you actually, put a business case together in terms of solving that problem, do you get enough financial incentive for not emitting that carbon? Now, where I can make friends and enemies simultaneously here is, in a way, I'm advocating heightening the cost of carbon, which in the short term hurts organisations, but quickly incentivizes you to find ways to avoid that cost, and a good way to do that will be to invest in low carbon heating, whatever those technologies that are available to you. So I think, there's a whole combination there, but I think if you look at it as a building fabric and M&E problem, and then you actually, if we could get to a fair price for carbon that actually reflects the benefit of not emitting it, I think that would incentivize and move things much more quickly, in that arena.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Mike. I'm just thinking about the procurement perspective to this as well, Kevin. I know that's your background and your expertise. I think we've touched on it a little bit, thinking about balancing the economic growth against sustainability and the commercial aspect. But yeah, I just wondered if you had any thoughts on kind of the role of procurement in this, and how we can make sure that procurement colleagues are involved in those strategic conversations around decarbonisation.
Yeah, and unsurprisingly, I would say procurement is important to this. And if we think of our Scope 3 emissions as a county council, our supply chain, those emissions will be significantly higher than us as an organisation. So it's absolutely vital that we get on top of it. I think of our regional work as a Yorkshire and Humber region. We've appointed some consultants to review our procurement strategies. And North Yorkshire's was found wanting in areas. I wrote it in 2016, 2017 to cover this period up to 2022, and things and aspirations have moved on. So I think it was a useful review to show us actually where we need to make improvements. And across our region, in terms of that chief exec direction, carbon reduction now is that number one target. So I think as procurement teams, we need to absolutely own that in terms of our strategies. We talked earlier around that challenge of austerity and budget reductions. COVID, unfortunately, will have an impact on that again. So in terms of our finances moving forward as local authorities, that will be a challenge that we need to address, because that pressure will come down on us. But again, what are the incentivizations for us to move on that? But equally, as heads of procurement or procurement teams in local authorities, what signals are we sending to the market? So our strategies are one thing. Is it clear and transparent that carbon reduction and wider social value is really important to us? But then is it followed through in terms of our projects? How do we commission construction, IT? How are we signalling to our supply chains that actually carbon reduction is really important to us? Are we evaluating? But then are we managing our contracts over the years that we have them? Are we making sure that net zero is important to us? So those are ways that we can really influence as procurement teams and as contract managers, just to make sure that it is important. And our supply chains, as we said, are multi-tiered, complex things that we need to, as procurement teams, to understand them more. So it's one thing saying that we want carbon reduction, but do we understand the items that we procure? First of all, how they are manufactured, how they are transported, and then how they are used. So data and intelligence is going to be vital to us. And again, I think procurement teams, we should be leading on supply chain intelligence. How can we then feed that back into the authority so that when we are commissioning and we are procuring, we are aware, because our supply chains know more about the things that they produce than what we do. So we go into them and we're learning from them, building that into our commissioning, and then driving it through in terms of what we want, how we manage it, to make sure that carbon reduction is key. So there's a massive role, I think, for procurement teams, and we absolutely need to step up data and intelligence on supply chain so we can help on that.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thanks, Kevin. It's really powerful. And I get the sense from conversations with colleagues across the network that it's a similar situation in Manchester. Would that be fair to say, David, that procurement are kind of really heavily involved in pushing that wider social value and decarbonisation agenda?
Yeah, absolutely. We've got, so within the kind of 5 work streams that I talked about before, which are the kind of 5 themes of our climate change action plan, our head of integrated procurement and commissioning is leading on one of those 5 work streams around the kind of consumption-based emissions and influencing suppliers. So doing a lot of work on that. I think there's a big education job to do, because I mentioned earlier on about carbon literacy training, which I think is a great introduction to the subject. You know, it's a 1-day accredited course, but it's not an occupational specific training. So I think, what we've got, I think we're at the point now where we're really interpreting what these things mean. So somebody who's working in capital programs, somebody who's working in finance, people who are working in development, they do need some more specialist support and training to start implementing some of these things through, obviously, into tender specifications. It's not just social value, it's getting upstream, I think, of that into tenders and doing things potentially in a different way than we've done in the past. And I suppose an example of that, linking back to the public sector decarbonisation scheme that I mentioned before, that scheme is bringing a whole range of new technologies, and we're having to get up to speed with people who are used to assessing and understanding certain ways of working and products into learning about new products and how they work and operate. So I think we shouldn't underestimate some of the kind of cultural and skills and knowledge that's required to embed the changes that we want to make. And I think procurement are absolutely central to that, both in terms of the whole procurement process, but obviously trying to drive that social value we're looking for out of our spend as well. So yeah, critical at Manchester.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that culture and behaviour change point is really key as well, isn't it? I think just, I mean, we're near the end of time for this recorded section of the session, but just before we kind of wrap up, I'd like to ask, just thinking back to something that I think Kevin briefly mentioned around sort of balancing economic development, economic growth, commercialisation with sustainability in the green agenda. I mean, we know hopefully we're kind of emerging from the pandemic now, it seems, fingers crossed. And, there's kind of more talk around economic recovery and how we can have a green industrial revolution, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, do you think that, I guess what I'm asking is that how can we ensure that we include in those strategies a way to kind of have that economic recovery, but in a green and sustainable way? Do you think that's possible? Is that kind of high up on the agenda in the sector at the moment? I don't know if David or Kevin, you want to come in on that one first?
I certainly think it is high up on the agenda. And if COVID has been horrific, but has taught us all some valuable lessons, one thing is that it is possible to do things differently. So as you said, in terms of communication, and it's possible to do things at speed as well. So I think in terms of procurement policy, some of the things we did at the start of the pandemic at speed in terms of changing our constitution, interpreting national procurement regulations and flexibilities, things that would have taken months and possibly years in terms of moving and getting legal things changed, we did at speed and we did at pace because of the emergency. So one thing we can do is understand that actually some of our changes to deliver carbon reduction are significant behaviour changes, influencing changes. But let's not forget that we can do these things at speed when we put our mind to it and when we have that aspiration and view. So if we can learn one thing, it's that we don't want to let usual standard decision making and timescales maybe fetter some of our ambition. And let's move at speed because it can be done. We've proven that. And we can make changes. We can change our working practice. So let's use some of those lessons and really try and push it forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Mike or David, I don't know if you want to come in on that one. I mean, Mike, I guess, if we're talking about a green industrial revolution, obviously the energy sector needs to play a big part in that. I don't know if you have any thoughts on how we can have a more green take on economic development as we come out of the pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as you sort of touched on already, I mean, the big thing is how we're using space. I mean, I think, there's so many lessons that have been learned in the last, sort of 12, 18 months, and I think every organisation has a different name. I think in Mighty we call it agile working, but I think, pick any word that sort of fits that. But the idea of, do we all need to be in that one place? Can we work? But that I think needs to flow through as quickly as we can into terms of, how do we actually want to use space? Do buildings need to be there? Can something be repurposed? I think it for me, it opens that whole debate in terms of, new build, be refurbishment. I think, you get some very interesting carbon modelling when you start to look at that and to say, what can you use spaces for? I think in terms of, I suppose, our sort of two key things here. One is, as you say, making sure that in getting that economic recovery in place, that we do it in a way that still makes sense. So, what we don't want, and I don't think we'll see. I mean, vehicles would be a good example, wouldn't it? Oh, we need to increase, increase economic growth. Okay, let's make more cars. Well, actually, let's not make more cars if they've all got sort of petrol and diesel engines. Actually, maybe we can accelerate the EV, revolution. So, I mean, I think I was quite disappointed the other day when this all is Tesla, isn't they? Building the facilities they were talking about in Europe and the UK. You think, well, actually, if there's ever a time for people to embrace some of these changes, now is it. But then I think the other thing we need to sort of think about is the environmental impact of COVID. So we talk quite easily about the positives of where, suddenly people could see the water clear in Venice and various other things. And we certainly see it in the UK in terms of our level of green energy production, reference to the full days of use, certainly last year. But just, if you look at it from a first, one-use plastics and other pieces, I do worry that for the next many years, we're going to be living with the environmental time bomb of everything that's come out of the last 12, 18 months. I mean, you wander around the streets now. I mean, how many masks do you see sort of just lying around with things being dropped, empty, hand gel bottles and things, and that whole piece? I almost feel that we've almost taken, when it comes to that sort of waste side of things, there's a danger of taking the big step backwards here. So I think somehow we've got to sort of get that back on track and not let that sort of get in the way of, maybe, yes, we can make improvements from a carbon perspective, but, what other time bombs have we sort of let there for us? And I think those can all be managed. I mean, for me, the way I would describe it is I think decarbonisation needs to be seen as a service. I think this ties neatly into the points that have been made on procurement, because it's how you package something to look at it. So, are we looking at something which is a one-off? We're actually looking at, okay, what are the 15 things we need to do? And is there a best structure for how we do those things going down the line? Can we actually do this, what we need to do, in a way that actually we can either do it as a cost neutral or a slight cost benefit? So a good example would be, let's put PV in before we try to put the air source heat pump in. Then we've actually created the cheaper electricity available to ourselves to actually power that heating solution with. So do it the other way around. You actually give yourself a capital cost burden. Do it the other way. You can actually do something which almost funds itself. So I think where the procurement piece comes and what sort of packages you're looking at, and perhaps how organisations be worked with, is going to be really important, because I think it needs to have that longer tail to it, and there's a right and wrong way of approaching some of these things. So I think it's a really exciting time, and the potential is massive. I think we just need to make sure we make some sort of decisions which have got sort of good medium term potential to them.
Yeah, just on that potential point, I mean, David, from your perspective, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but Greater Manchester is one of the fastest growing regions in the UK, right, both in terms of people and economy. So, I mean, I just wondered what levers we can pull there to try and make sure that growth is sustainable and not carbon intensive.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's still the whole, we're still kind of growing as a country. There's still got a big shortage of housing. So I think, we are still in a situation where we need to find land for more housing. And obviously in a place like Manchester, that's been done at density in the core of the conurbation, which has generally been obviously a lot of apartment buildings. So reusing that brownfield land in order to help protect the greenfield sites. We've got a kind of planning document, I suppose. Local plan is our document, which will be hopefully completed in 2023. There is also a Greater Manchester-wide planning document. Stockport are no longer part of that now, but it's called Places for Everyone, and that's going to set that agenda for the city. So I think that's key lever, obviously, in terms of planning for future development, where we're trying to get to net zero on new developments. So that's the key lever. And I think with the broader economic point, I suppose I'd just separate out maybe a little bit of the kind of green sectors from other economic growth. So we produced our industrial strategy back in 2019, and Greater Manchester did the same, and both of them had a lot in there around green growth. Greater Manchester has a sort of mission-based approach to clean growth. And then our economic recovery plan we produced last November in response to the pandemic, which had £800 million worth of investable propositions to government in there. Lots of cities and places did the same thing. And of those, about 190 million of them were kind of labelled as zero carbon projects. And that included things like housing retrofit and other things, hydrogen options. So you've got things like that, which are very specifically zero carbon. But I think the broader point for places, and particularly for places like Manchester with the city centre, is that this is also kind of intrinsically linked to what the future of economic growth is like in those city centres. And what we're really hearing now, and going back to the point that was made earlier about space, is we want to see really good quality public spaces, more space for pedestrians, cyclists, active travel, good quality public realm, and people want those parks close to where they live, etc. So there's a huge point around kind of ensuring that you retain the economic growth you've got in terms of the non-green growth sectors, just by providing the kind of good quality environment that we need. So I think there's that aspect to the economic recovery as well, which we shouldn't forget about. I should probably make a plug here because Manchester's got its first park in the city centre at Mayfield, under construction at the moment, which is a really exciting thing for us at the moment, which has had government funding. So, yeah, I think that's an important part of the kind of placemaking aspect.
Yeah, it's round the corner from my house, so I'm looking forward to that one. So I think we've got about 10, 15 minutes left then. So just in terms of kind of final takeaways from this conversation, I mean, obviously, I think any colleagues watching this will be involved with decarbonisation strategy in some way, or at least interested in it. So just in terms of kind of final messages and any pointers from each of you on how we can really champion decarbonisation across the local public sector and make sure that we get those strategies in place and implement them and really achieve those targets. So I don't know if Mike, you want to go first on that one, maybe?
I had a feeling that was coming my way. I don't know why. I think for me, one has to, you need an optimistic perspective. At the end of the day, to solve any problem, you need to recognise you've got a problem and then do something about it. And I would say not so many years ago, when I was talking to many organisations, almost in the first instance, I'd be having to explain to someone that you've got a problem. Maybe in that time I might have talked about you using more energy than you need to. Can I do something about that? I think the great thing now is everyone gets there's a problem. I don't think, I appreciate some people have a different view on climate change. That's fine. But broadly, I think as society, we recognise that we are putting too much burden on natural resources. We're creating too much heat. Those are both really bad things. We need to do something about it, and we need to do it PDQ. So I think in that instance, we know we've got a problem. Therefore, you can, the next step is have a plan. I think we've talked today about plans. I think there is no the plan. The key is to have a plan and then to actually make those things happen. And I think as long as that happens, a lot of the problems that we're facing today can be dealt with. And I think I'm very optimistic because I think the fact that we're having these discussions and the fact that this ownership sits here now, it actually proves that that things are gonna happen, because this isn't window dressing. We're not just sort of turning a few lights off late at night because that makes them better, or we're saying, we'll put a few trees in, that makes it better. Fundamentally, I think we understand it's how we operate spaces, it's how we have spaces, it's how we actually get to those spaces, it's actually how we live. And the trick here is to maintain the quality of life that we all enjoy, but in a way that actually creates less carbon burden. And I think we've seen so many ways to do that. And so, my message would be one of optimism. I think this is a solvable problem. Sometimes people do get at me slightly when I say that, but I genuinely do. And I think you have to be optimistic, because otherwise you get to the point of, well, why bother? And it's not just us, the rest of the world gets it. And people talk about China and places. China gets it. They don't want to be, producing their electricity with the ways that they are with coal things anymore. They're looking, you look at the biggest growth markets for PV, for EV and things. They're all there. That's for a reason. So this isn't a case of, well, they're not bothering. The US has come back into sort of the COP world and things. So we're all pulling in the same direction here. So let's just get out there and make a difference.
Yeah, absolutely. No, with that positive attitude, definitely. Kevin, final thoughts from you?
Yeah, I quite agree in terms of optimism. It is clear in which the direction we are travelling in is, and we need to get on board with that. And I think in terms of procurement, I keep thinking around it's collaboration. So collaboration internally, so our influencing with stakeholders around how we commission, how we operate, but equally with our supply chains, because we are not going to be able to solve this without a collaborative approach with our multi-tiered supply chains. How can we deliver together? So it's going to take behaviour change, it's going to take leadership. So what are our procurement strategies and our approaches? What are we signalling to our supply chains? But how can we work together? Because that's how we can affect change, and that's how we can deliver. So it's all around being aspirational, being confident, as we've said, but being collaborative and bringing those behaviours, and together we can deliver this.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Kevin. David?
It's hard to not repeat some of what's been said, but I suppose from more of a kind of an internal public services perspective, some observations for colleagues who might be watching this. I think governance is quite important, and I think an observation and lesson learned from Manchester is that we've really benefited from having the climate emergency motion to really get the political buy-in, and then the leadership of this agenda in Manchester City Council is via the Deputy Chief Exec and City Treasurer. That's one person, that's her job title, but she's the Section 151 officer. I think actually that's been really, really important to sort of get the buy-in from those kind of services across everything from procurement and commissioning. But clearly from a financial aspect, there is some investment required into this to make it happen. So having her on board and leading this for an officer level alongside the relevant executive member from a political perspective has been really, really important. And I think that, coupled with that kind of partnership approach that I mentioned earlier on across the city with our external partners, is kind of what is driving this agenda locally. So that would be my kind of key takeaway message.
Yeah, well, thanks. Those are some really powerful points to end on there. I think that's just about time for our recorded session, I think. So at this point, I'll just say thank you very, very much to the three of you, to Kevin, David and Mike, for joining us today to talk about this. Thanks for everybody who's joined as well and taken part in the live chat. I think we do have time now for about 10 minutes or so of audience questions. So we'll switch the feeds over and we'll see you over there. But for now, thank you very much, everyone, and see you soon. Okay, welcome back, everyone. I think we're live now and we've got about 15 minutes for questions. I know Mike needs to leave us at 1:15 sharp, so we'll try and get through as many of your questions as we can before that. So we'll just dive straight in. I think quite a popular question early on was a question around how do we incentivize partners and local businesses to prioritize carbon reduction if they don't see it as a pressing issue? I know Kevin in North Yorkshire procurement, particularly working closely with suppliers and supply chains on that. Do you have any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of elements to this. First of all, it's around behaviour and what are the signals we send out as an organisation in terms of how we act and how we operate. And from a procurement and a supply chain point of view, how are we looking to evaluate our tenders and our bids? And in our commissioning intentions and our specifications, are we making it clear? So is there a clear signal to our supply chains, to the wider market, that A, first of all, we take this seriously, B, that we assign a value to it, and it's not just a tokenistic gesture, so a 5% of the evaluation is given on carbon reduction. Because if that signal is clear and unequivocal, and there is a significant value put upon it, our supply chains will then be able to understand it and will be able to modify their approach and their submissions to us. And we understand that there will be a cost to these things as well, so we have to work with our supply chain. So that pre-procurement work, this shouldn't come as a surprise to our partners and our supply chains. So if we make it clear, signal right from the outset, and work collaboratively as we build specifications and outcomes from our procurements, I think that would really help in that regard.
Yeah, definitely. I think that collaboration and co-design, co-production piece is really key, isn't it, across sectors? We have a question around leisure centres specifically. So someone's asked, our leisure centres have the highest carbon emissions of all our services. Do you have any advice, experience or strategies that would help us reduce these emissions over time? And Mike, I know you said that Mighty have done a fair few projects with leisure centres, etc. So I wonder if you have any top tips there for leisure centres.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think one of the big challenges with leisure centres is their length of time of operation. I mean, assuming there to be sort of a gym there, I mean, literally you can have probably something that's open from 6 a.m. to easily can be sort of 8, 9, 10, even later at night. So, I mean, potentially you've got up to about 18 hours of energy use there. So I think when you compare leisure centres to most buildings, they always end up looking quite a high energy use purely because of the run hours. But what I tend to find when we sort of look at them is that, let's just assume there's a swimming pool there, at some point there may well have been a combined heat and power plant put in, because swimming pools are great for taking that waste heat or the heat from the CHP and using it the water. But often what happens is those CHPs have got badly maintained, they've been turned off. They've perhaps that would be one area to look at to see if there's actually equipment there which should be working that isn't. The other side of things is often on controls as well. So there could well be quite a complex building management system installed, but is it actually set up correctly? Is it actually even understood by the by the end users? And often what we find is that there's quite a lot of functionality in these sites which is just not understood. Things are turned on, things are turned off. So all the clever bits there in terms of setting temperatures back, turning ventilation off at a certain time, turning heating off, particularly in sort of leisure areas or things, just doesn't happen. So you end up with an awful lot of kit running an awful lot of the time. So I think I would certainly recommend, a technical NG audit, and then also, really an engagement piece in terms of, do the actual people operating the centre really understand the implications of their actions? So, a great one I often find is, you sort of you have a gym area which is got air conditioning running, and then people think, oh, it's a bit cool in here. I know, I'll open some doors, and before you know it, we've got the quick air conditioning banging away, and we've got sort of fresh air being let in through the doors. Now at the moment, with COVID and things are quite different, and it's all about getting the air through. So we haven't got all those efficiencies there we can normally have. But I think it's a combination for me of using technology that's installed together with how you operate it, and then looking at some of the opportunities. I mean, the leisure centres lend themselves to PV installation in terms of electricity usage. You've got a big clear roof space there. They are poorly insulated generally as buildings. Now that is a more capitally intensive thing to do, but it's well worth something to look at. Particularly on swimming pool roofs and things, that can actually have quite a big issue opportunity there. So I think there's a whole plethora of things, but I would say on the technical side of things, a good NG audit would probably make a big dent in what you're seeing.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thanks, Mike. Question around electric charging infrastructure, well, specifically in remote areas, e.g. moors and the Dales. I think that's definitely aimed at you, that one, Kevin, North Yorkshire perspective on electric vehicles, moors and Dales.
Yeah, absolutely. And that rural challenge is a real issue in this area. So there's a couple of elements to think. First of all, the range of vehicles and the lack of charging points can drive a consumer behaviour, so people might shy away from it. That in turn then causes an issue, because if there's a lack of vehicles and a lack of need for it, suppliers won't see the need to put in those charging points. And if you think of the return on investment in an urban area for suppliers to put in those charging points, it will be quicker, it will be easier. So there's a real challenge in terms of that rural issue for us. And I think it all comes down to market intervention, and it's very similar to what we have with broadband for rural areas. We've had to intervene with government grants and funding to essentially level up that opportunity, so suppliers are not disadvantaged from coming to the rural area to putting in that infrastructure. And then when that happens, lo and behold, the demand rises. So I think we need something similar in that area, and that's something for the county council to do, and others partners too, to look to attract funding to really break that cycle and level up that opportunity, so that return on investment can actually be made. And once we can do that, we can get the infrastructure built, that usage will follow, and that virtual circle will then take off for itself. But again, it's around that market intervention and trying to make sure that, because of the standard business case and return on investment that suppliers will see from an urban area, it just needs to be different in a rural area, but it can be done, and we're seeing investment going in now. And the more that happens, the more charging points that we'll put in, and it will just help that business case to be successful.
Yeah, no, great, good, optimistic take there, Kevin. So another question that's coming around: if you buy renewable certified electricity for your organisation, can this be reported as zero carbon emissions? I don't know if, David, you have any thoughts on that from a Manchester perspective.
Yeah, I think it's a really important question. And obviously, as we've seen from trying to decarbonise heat, we're going to be using more electricity. We're obviously just talking then about electric vehicles and the increases on the kind of load on electricity. So I think this is going to be really accounting for organisations. Something we've wrestled with in Manchester for a long time, because we've purchased green electricity, but we've always used the emissions factor from the national grid. There's a sort of view around not double counting some of the renewable aspects of the grid. So we've always felt that's in some ways slightly unfair. And obviously there's quite a lot of companies now who guarantee the source of electricity through REGOs, kind of renewable energy guarantee origin schemes. As part of our climate change action plan, this is something we've actually tried to address over the last sort of 6 to 9 months. And we actually commissioned a study to look into the opportunities around a number of options around large scale energy generation, which might be actually operated by the council or with a partner, probably outside a local authority area, to guarantee that supply, or looking at a power purchase agreement, which some larger organisations, including universities, have done in the country, where you're guaranteeing that source of electricity direct from offshore wind farm or hydroelectric or whatever the source may be. So those are things we've been looking at the council, and obviously there's a smaller generation assets around your buildings across your estate, but in terms of the scale of electricity that organisations are buying, you're very unlikely to get all of that from the buildings that you operate. So I think it's a real issue, especially as the increase of electricity use is bound to go up over the next sort of decade.
Great, thanks, David. Another question's come in around reflects on some of the sort of skills and knowledge stuff actually that we've touched on in this session and other ones this week so far. So questions come in that says, what advice would you give to a new graduate who's been hired to create a net zero action plan for a housing association? Are there any key resources you would recommend to help broaden my knowledge of the current issues surrounding decarbonisation within the industry? I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on that in terms of key resources, key knowledge areas to focus on. Mike, any thoughts on that one?
I mean, I think the first of all, I would say is from a sort of technical perspective, there's probably two obvious areas which really stand out as to where you'd want to get yourself more au fait. One being in terms of the opportunities to enhance insulation in the building, be it in terms of roof, cladding, windows, etc. The second area is actually in terms of technology would be air source heat pumps, because it's very likely that large scale replacement of sort of gas boilers in those properties with air source heat pumps will be a technology that you do sort of want to embrace and go with. So I appreciate that that's not the whole piece. And clearly, I think if, I don't know what knowledge base you're starting from here, but I mean, if it's not something that you've been involved in at all before, I think, clearly, some training or courses, from a sort of net zero pathway perspective, what's actually involved in that, I think will be helpful to you. Probably also, I would suggest maybe getting a good local specialist involved, who's been down that route before with that local housing experience, because there are some sort of real nuances here in terms of what works and what doesn't. I appreciate, because I don't know the base we're starting from here, this could be a very long answer or a very short answer, but those would be sort of some of my sort of handy hints really of things to be au fait with.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, David, would you echo that? Would you think, or anything from your perspective?
Yeah, I suppose obviously I'm coming from more of a generalist perspective, so less on the kind of technical intervention side. I think having been through this, obviously on behalf of kind of a council and a city, it's a slightly different type of organisation, but I do think it's really important at the outset to sort of define what you mean by net zero, carbon neutral, zero carbon. There's quite a lot of terms around there. So are you aiming for kind of true zero, or are you doing offset? I think understanding what your emissions are to start with, you really do need a good organisational baseline. So looking across, obviously, if you send around buildings, travel in terms of staff, looking at the things that you buy and procure, and actually trying to measure what your current baseline is going to be a really important starting point. And then you can look at the impact of those interventions, obviously cost them up in terms of their impact on carbon, but obviously on other costs. And then look at some of those things that will happen externally anyway, like decarbonisation of the grid, etc., versus those things that you're going to drive more locally within your organisation. I think that is really important. I think just in terms of that training and expertise, there are some good training courses out there. People like the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research, who do things on budgets, carbon budgets, organisational carbon budgets, etc. And that will maybe help you set a target and a trajectory to get to net zero.
Yeah, thanks, David. So I'm just very conscious of time. I know Mike does need to leave us in literally a minute, but we've got one more question left. I think it would be a shame not to answer it. So I'll put this question to Kevin, Mike, and if you do need to leave, thank you very much for joining us and for giving us some of your time, both today and for the recording. So thank you for that. But yeah, so final question from the audience. There's a question around majority of ordering is online. For Section 2, can the carbon value of the products be included in invoicing/ordering process? So I think that's a question around the carbon cost of shipping and logistics and how we can account for that, really. I mean, I don't know, Kevin, from a procurement perspective, whether you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, so certainly we can evaluate tenders and take into account the cost of shipping and the miles that would have to be travelled for goods and services. I wonder whether this is more around a behavioural point as well of consumer ordering as well, because we're all looking to try and source things for the lowest cost, but inevitably low cost sourcing tends to come from overseas. So low cost in terms of pounds spent will often equate to a higher cost in terms of carbon. So could these things be demonstrated at the point of order or on invoices? Yes, that's a system issue, and I think would be relatively straightforward. Would it help drive some behaviour? Well, I think that's incumbent on us, isn't it? Around will we make a different decision when we understand the carbon cost to our purchases, and if we will, I think that'll be useful.
Yeah, fantastic. So I think we just lost Mike there, but thank you for that, Kevin. So that's all the questions, I think, and we are pretty much bang on time, which is quite incredible. So I'll wrap up there, I think, and just say yeah, thank you very, very much indeed to David and Kevin and Mike for joining us. I really enjoyed this discussion. I hope the audience did, and thank you to the audience as well for joining and submitting those questions. So. Yeah, we hope you enjoyed the session. I've definitely enjoyed hosting it. Please do check out all the other sessions. There's a bunch of great speakers and topics coming up throughout the rest of the week. And join the conversation as well on social media, hashtag iNetworkNetZero and hashtag YPONetZero. But in the meantime, thanks again to everyone and goodbye for now. Thanks.